WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and it's August the 2nd. We're moving along in virus time and experimenting still. So today we have a different backup visual, and we're experimenting with that. And bear with us. We have a nice microphone that I don't have to be right on top of. It's Zoom, and I have to report that my relatives in Australia have been doing things on Zoom and being very impressed, even though they are tied to their landline phones. They don't want to give them up, but they're finding it's kind of fun to have Zoom and be able to go to a major meeting with Zoom. It beats the alternatives, and even in a non-virus time, it's useful. But it's very popular, and you can get a lot of people on the same screen at once. And you can be given permission to speak. We have an administrative possibility. I haven't used it yet because I haven't broken myself in and practiced. And perhaps I'll say something about salvage first, but I do have a birthday to announce. Sheila Wiley used to work with us for years, and she's turning 90 on the 3rd, and she is quite with it and has written a little précis of the places where she worked. And her daughter, Katie, has sent a note to us to ask if we could send a birthday card, and yes, we did. And so it's always interesting to bring people together. Apropos of nothing, another Wiley, unrelated, came to visit at about the same time, and 3 of us were sitting there, and the world was so small. And that is important. I think if you go to Europe or to England or even Australia or New Zealand, you get something that's communion. It's where you have a heavy-duty respect for getting together. The U.S. is something different. It has good soil, good rainfall, and people who were entrepreneurs and perhaps a little more sophisticated than most. And there were resources of trees and minerals. And so when you become private and innovative in your own soul, you sometimes leave the communion. And that is disappointing for people who have been used to growing up with being together. I watch the geese in the pond at the big dig, and they just enjoy being with each other. They make pairs on their own, but they gather in 20 or 30 as a group, and often when one flies, they all fly. They don't have to do that. But it just reminds us that there is a care for a total communion. And we're lacking that some. It's not just the politics. It's not just the ugly environmentalists who get in the way. It's not just the rich. It's a total national thing. And We encounter that a little bit with the virus. The virus is very much a biological thing, and humans are a part of a biological uh, region around the world. It's finite. And if we only go for the resources and don't go for the uh, biodiversity, then very shortly we're extinct. And I think we're well on the way to doing that if we don't be very careful. Uh, it's not just one person or one item, or it's where there's an interaction, a compounding of many different items, and the universities and major organizations have begun to realize that. Beckman Center in Urbana is part of that, where Arnold Beckman, who was famous for making instruments for measuring science, decided that scientists should get together in groups. Those groups can be two, they can be 5 or 6, they can include males as well as females, as well as geographers or artists. And depending on the problem that you have an input. It's not easy, but it does happen. WEFT happens to have been with the radio station for now about 35 years, and part of that is because of this sort of community. It's not just sitting in downtown with bars and restaurants and drinking a beer. It's much more than that. It means a commitment to something that you find interesting, that you find relatives that are interesting. You find your life changes because somebody comes up with an idea that intrigues you. We need to be able to get together and do that sort of thing. And it's not happening. There's too many individuals. There's too many lobbyists. And so some of this is political, but it will take years to change that. That's if there is any decision to change it. We're still running off to the rainforests and taking wood, and all the species are going before we even know what we've got. The world is not in a good shape, and there are little portions of it that do things differently. Brazil is one of them. And I'm reminded that my sister is near to the border of New South Wales at the moment, and Australians who are in Europe or Britain came back to Melbourne and they partied when they shouldn't have been partying. Australia was doing very well with the virus. And then two of them went to Brisbane, which is in Queensland, and is in between is New South Wales. Well, my sister has a daughter 25 miles away. She's in Victoria, and she's not able to visit her daughter or vice versa without all sorts of documentation in an attempt to cut down on the virus. We sometimes have managerial things that are monolithic, and that has reminded us that several food factories, including one at Grand Tool, handling a lot of our food without knowing exactly what they're doing in terms of having people separated, or it's too much in one place. So we have to think of things like the farmer's market. It was raining today, but people were there. And that sort of loyalty is good. Bata has had a farmer's market for many, many years. But part of it has been that sort of camaraderie that I'm begging for. Uh, if it's you go to Packer and they have changed their, uh, they've taken advantage of the virus to change the walkway through their warehouse, a massive amount of reorganization, and that involves this sort of get together. The Children's Museum, on the other hand, has lost out, and it is closed. The Salvation Army is closing. And yet, if I go to Salt and Light in Urbana, it seems to be doing well. The uh, Goodwill seems to be doing well. Uh, the internet is in there, so sometimes the internet gets to be the scapegoat for what is wrong with the environment. But and that is true. A lot of technologies get done, and you're left with the television set or the telephone. I have several telephones that you used to dial in a circle, and if drama people are going to go to a certain era when that sort of telephone was used, then that says something. So do we get rid of that? Do we salvage the platinum and other rare metals in there? We don't know. We don't have a concerted effort. The recycling centers go in and out of existence. The households interested in pollution solution did a good job and encouraged the city of Champaign to have a recycling center. And it went well for many years, but then got a little costly. So it was reduced to dumpsters out by Kmart. And they were kind of interesting too. And the very thing that I'm talking about, people would go to the dumpster and then they start talking and chatting and exchanging pieces of functional reuse that they didn't expect to be able to do anything but throw out. And so recycling becomes a part of your soul. So you have to think about it. If you're going to wash clothes, are you going to wash clothes in clean water? Are you going to put soap in there? Are you going to put petroleum, better cleaning materials in there that don't disappear? They're there for good. They might include, they might appear in a whale some 20 years later. They might appear in somebody's breast milk if you don't watch out. So what sort of controls do we have on technology? Do we want to go to the moon, or do we want to stay at home and do things? There's tremendous drive to find out what's on the other side of the fence and to discover and to do things like look at the universe and find out where we came from. But there are other excitements that come with knowing your biochemistry, knowing how you can relate to the soil. How do you relate to a bird that can sing and you cannot see the same way as that bird because that bird has better vision than you will ever have and will be able to sing on certain notes that you can never reach? The wonder is there, but that wonder has to convert into saving things. We're saving little prairies. There's a beauty that we have at Rantoul. we want to know how it relates to its surroundings, and uh, we want to look at the plants that are there. That means you have to be a little bit aware of what you do. If you're going to be a chef, for instance, you have to know the names of the things you're going to eat and cook with. You have to have tools. So there is a commitment to this. So uh, you might end up at the country pub in England, but those people are there like the veterinarians that uh, will be out with the sheep and the cattle when they're in difficulty. Uh, so I've been doing the rounds of uh, the recycle centers, and part of it is that I have a stove that is uh, came, but we didn't ever install it. So it needs to get out, and should it be recycled or should it be going to the landfill, or should it be going to the metal recycle? Those are the sorts of things you have to think about. They're very little things. They're very everyday things. They're things that where you need to talk to your counterpart. Are you going to wear plastic pants, or are you going to wear uh, cotton pants? Is that a natural fiber that you're using? It may well operate well in a washing machine, but uh, uh, the natural fiber is going to not pollute the environment as some other materials will, and they'll be around perhaps forever. Uh, it's very complex, and it's very hard for people who are in poverty to have access to that knowledge. If you're doing 3 jobs at the same time, there's not much time for you to do anything other than sleep and eat. So we have to think about just the really small things that we do. If it's my brother who has a penchant for using sugar, then you need to know what sugar does to brain cells. And the more we research, the more we find out that use of sugar and excess salt and excess fat as preservatives means we have to think just one move. If you're going to have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, how much sugar do you put in it? If it's a potato or a tomato, how much salt will you use? Sometimes if you're sweating a lot in summertime, then you need the salt to be part of your body. But so you have to think on subtleties. If you're an agriculturalist, you have to think about the sandy soil and what it will hold as far as fertilizer is concerned, and the deep organic and rich soil, which will hold much more fertilizer. And what sort of fertilizer do you make? A lot of our fertilizer is nitrogen, phosphorus, and lime, and uh, we need to think how you make those fertilizers. Nitrates involve a lot of electricity. Do we have that electricity? Do we make dams that give you hydroelectricity? Well, that's for the ecologists, dams are a damn nuisance because they alter the native balance between water and the surrounding creek banks and the niches that creatures have. the creatures are very adaptable usually, and we have certain species that are more than adaptable. They get to be a nuisance, a noxious weed, for instance. But mostly those plants are interacting. If you have a forest, you might have several species that are connecting with their roots and with minor chemicals. If you have a sheep that is on a healthy soil and you take it to a water-worn soil like a beach, then one element or two or three elements like zinc and copper and molybdenum will be lacking in that place. And you can take the fleece of that sheep and lift it off because the fibers are weakened. And so we need education, scientific education. And how do you encourage that? Our Children's Science Museum has just lost out, but uh, some of this stuff ain't easy. It's what we uh, need to back up. We need, if we can't do it ourselves, we need to encourage people who are interested and able, but we then need to ask those scientists to give us the information that they have in a form that we as neophytes can accept and work with. I want to go to Campus Town, and I want to go to Campus Town when it was early. There was this Boneyard Creek that went through. There was a theological college intending to be a theological college, which was the first part of the Illinois University, or the University of Illinois. But gradually Green Street evolved and Wright Street evolved, which was between Urbana and the new town of West Urbana, which became Champaign. Right on that corner of Green and Wright Street, there was a bookstore, and adjacent to it was a huge old house that was a fraternity house. Illinois was a prime candidate for having sororities and fraternities, and these were an attempt to get people together that had notions about academia and had support people. So there were something like 56 fraternities. The one next to Follett's was a big fraternity. It was actually the peak of the three-story building was higher than the roof of Follett's, which was also a multi-story building. It was set back with a lawn in front and a privet hedge and a garden, and it had a veranda with a swing, and this was a house of character. It lost out to the Depression in the 30s, and the Dallenbach family bought it, and the family developed it as a restaurant and as apartments. So Mrs. Smith, who came from Lebanon, Tennessee, was a member of the Dallenbach family, and she went round with a chalk. So to start with, this building was a fraternity that had big lounge rooms downstairs. It had big toilets, fancy toilets upstairs. Uh, the rooms that were had big closets that you could almost use as an apartment. And on the top floor, there were dormitories, but there was also a ballroom. And so the fraternity people would be in what was the ballroom. This was a social event to have a fraternity. Well, Mrs. Smith was pretty astute, and she created 17 apartments, and they were rather wonderful because they were quite different. And some of them bent around the corner because there was a water pipe or something, and so this was a place of character, and the board of trustees of the university used to meet there. This was a restaurant that was well known. If you wanted to attend, you had to have a tie and coat and be dressed appropriately. And there was a piano, a grand piano that people that we know used to play there, and the violinist would come, and there were Tiffany era cages with birds that could also sing, and cats, and this was a place of interest before the Union was built. And so we lived there for a while and became a part of that family. And when the parade would go through it went through on Green Street, and you were on the veranda, watching from the veranda. It doesn't go through Green Street anymore, but that was part of the campus universe. And the campus was a little different from Champaign and a little different from Urbana. And so these three institutions grew up a little different. I took probably 100 photographs of the old fraternity as it became a restaurant of note. Mrs. Smith was the maitre d'. There was another lady, and I've forgotten her name. And there was a sister that belonged to the Dallenbach family. And the Dallenbachs used to help to run the county board, county fairground, and just were part of those 7 to 10 families in Champaign that ran Champaign, and there were counterparts in Havana. And now, how do you infuse into that sort of structure? It's interesting, it's exciting. It may be almost impossible to join that retinue of people. So we're losing a little of that. I'm very much aware that the Grubb family came here, and they're Grubb engravers. They came from Decatur in 1956. So I met a grandfather at one stage, and by the time I came here, they had expanded to 8 buildings in this general area. There had been wooden buildings and wooden theaters and muddy streets, and the general area had burned twice, and so a new set of brick buildings went up. There were 8 buildings, 100 feet long, with a 40-foot alleyway between, and there was another set that faced Walnut Street. the office of note for the Grubb family was on Walnut Street. And they provided etchings for newspapers, whether it be the News Gazette or other agencies. In those days, you had a linotype printer. That meant that a gentleman sat there and copied and would produce a little lead piece that had the letter on it. And you would insert that into blocks of wood, so you would put up a page. And this was pretty laborious work, and you had to check it out to see that it was correct. And so proofing was important. But you could see the linotype through the window, and you could hear it going, clickety clack 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 clickety clack clack, and making those lead images. Once you had a lead image, you could then pull a paper mache copy of that image and send it off to somewhere else, like the Grubb family had a base in Watseka. And then Watseka could pour its own lead into the mold and print their paper at that location. That went to letterpress, which was very near and dear to that linotype situation. It went to rotogravure, so you would have an offset press. You would have an image photo exposed onto a sensitive piece of aluminum. And that piece of aluminum would then be put onto a drum, and it would make an impression on another drum, which then would print it onto paper. That was called offset press. It was huge. It required a lot of people to make the image in the first place, where you had golden rods, they were called. You made a place for your photographs and your words, and the goldenrod material was just thick enough to hold photographs. You had to have material to stick the photographs in place and have holes so that the photograph could be exposed, and so you would have hundreds of these for, say, a publication that had 100 pages. You would have 100 items ready to be exposed. Then you would have 100 aluminum plates to be exposed, and then they would run on the offset press. That building now, the newspaper industry has lost out to the technology of the internet, and that press has recently been removed by huge cranes, and partially because it had so much ink and other materials that were kind of spongy, couldn't be cleaned easily, so that was recycled, and space is open for development and has been bought for possibly more restaurants. We have quite a few restaurants, but they're popular, and so are the bars that go with them. That sort of printing was lost out to the computer era. And so the Grubb family that had 7 or 8 buildings on Walnut Street and on Market Street, more or less reduced to doing plaques and awards and things like that. Every once in a while they'd have a publication. But I am in a building where we work with 2 buildings, and then we condense to 1 building, and It happens to be a building that has uh, uh, fire sprinklers, and that's very helpful to us because we haven't been the best uh, fire protection people because we work with paper and we work with minerals and chemicals that print on paper. And we do silkscreen printing, which is quite different from the rotogravure printing, where we have a very sensitive gelatin on a plastic back, and you expose that image to light, and where the light hits, then it will rot the uh, gelatin. And so in effect, you have a gelatin image of what you want to reproduce. Then you take a silk screen that's spread across a frame, and you gradually, very carefully put that into that gelatin that is ready to be set. If it's too soft, it goes squishy. If it's too hard, it doesn't stick to the threads. So you can have a very coarse silk screen, or you can have a very fine one. If you're working with fine materials like circuits for batteries or for radios or what have you, then you need a very fine silk screen, at least 12, I think was my sort. You'd have much more lines of silk or indeed platinum or other materials to make that settle into that gelatin. Then it would dry, and you would pull off the writing plastic, and if lucky, you didn't have any glitches. The image was right there on your silk screen. You would have to block it off with tape so that you could then have a silk screen press with hinges, and if you were lucky, you had a deck that held that piece of paper you were going to print onto steady, and you could put the silk screen with its hinges down on the paper. The paper had to be registered if you wanted it in the right place. So you had little grommets that you could put your paper into, and that would suffice to getting your item registered. If you were going to do 2 or 3 colors, then you might be lucky. It might be the moon in the middle of the sky, and it didn't matter whether it was here or there. It was okay. But if you were going to do something that it was a person, and you were going to do 3 images, they had to be right on top of each other, because otherwise you would look like you had a strangely out of focus comic book. So this is an art that has been over the years very helpful. It has allowed people to print on paper, but to also print on bottles, on footballs, on clothing, and it's still a viable art. It can be used by artists. We have like 30 images that we made on silkscreen. We've made them rather high contrast so that you can put your own imagination into them, and those silk screens become part of our media to try and convince the world that their ecosystem, their heritage, ecology is endangered. There's very, very little of it out there. So once again, we're asking for people to be involved. We teach at Parkland College for many years and encouraged other groups to do things like the Master Naturalist and Master Gardener. And uh, we, we helped to set up a Grand Prairie Friends that had an advocacy for prairie and still does, and has plots of prairie that they care for in Loder and in Paxton and in other places like along railroad lines. And they have also done preservation work with forests, but part of their success is in getting people together. And that was what WEFT has done. It's what Grand Prairie Friends have done in Cole County, especially. They have something like 1,000 acres now. But if they have a work day, they can sometimes get 120 people to be helping. And the help is only part of it. Part of it is that you're talking to each other as an artist, as a scientist, as a journalist, and you're gradually getting to know each other. And that is something that is not as normal here as it is in places like Europe. So we look for more of that. We look for small groups that I see them in the detention pond. I often wave, but sometimes I don't get a wave back. It's very difficult to communicate sometimes. That may be your own problem, but it may not be your own problem. I go to the nearby supermarket, and a lot of the people are registering their purchase with a computer. So they're not talking to anyone. They're not making jokes with each other or telling each other stories. I don't do that because I want to go to the checkout where the young lady that's tabbing my material may have dreadlocks. And I look at her and I say, it took you a long time to put that together, didn't you? And then since saying that, I've realized that that young woman can't go swimming. And I didn't really realize that hair was such a problem for Black community people. And it's just one of those little things that spark when you start to talk to someone and share dignitaries. You have to be prepared to let people understand who you are. You have to give forth some of your background and not to be dominating, but to be friendly. And then you have to listen, and then you have to remember, and you have to be able to make notes in your mind of what it is that happened. Sometimes many years ago, I keep sorting out documents in our one storefront, and every once in a while, I have to look at something. Oh, did we do that? Yes, we did that, and it's minor, and it only goes on to another generation because you happen to be in a place where something counts. It might be that we have a lot of materials that could easily be burned. And you just have to remind someone that burning wood is a carbon problem, and that recycling wood in a different manner to reuse it the same way as Packer is doing is very healthy. So with a twinkle in your eye, you can sometimes add a note that no one will know about, but it will go on to another generation, you hope. And it often does, especially with young people. They're keen to get information and to use it. Uh, and and to use it in a fun way. If they want to do these sorts of things, they might want to have a Harley Davidson too. They might want to be out there with the breeze in their hair. And uh, I used to enjoy just running. When I first came here, I would run on railroad lines that had very little traffic, and I put my arms out, and I let my hair grow. It was first it looked like a bullhead, but then it got to be longer, so I could feel my hair. And people get that sort of feeling. They make have achievements, but often the achievements are not on their own. They're with friends and relatives that they never realized would be their friends and relatives. And sometimes parents are also their friends and relatives. The person who I called about two faucets that were dripping, and they were annoying the hell out of me because they uh, they were old darkroom faucets, and I had the temerity to use the hot water, and I could never turn it off. I could put in several different washers that were mounted and whatever. But this is an old building. The Grubb family came here in 1957, and that was probably a dark room that had been there for many years. So the person that came to answer my call was Colberts, and Colberts have been a name for plumbing for many years. Harold Colbert, and now the son and the grandson. And I just was overjoyed to be working with people who knew these buildings from years ago and knew some of the difficulties and had equipment to be able to change an extra faucet that was also dripping, but it required tools that I haven't seen. It was not the sort of thing that you could do as a primary person that was doing the job themselves. So I'd even made the mistake that this was I bought faucets for inch pipes, and it was a half-inch pipe. So you have to have a sense of humor about it. You try and you do, and still this block has some of the elements of the past. So I go over to Old Town, and a street has been closed off, and the Old Town building that's being worked on has been made a shell. The intent is to keep the original Old Town look, and the shell is propped up by sticks and whatever, and the infill is going to be more modern, or it's going to be definitely modern, and it's going to be used as in the future, but it will also have the element of what was Old Town in the past. There's a tendency to remove buildings before their time. If you, once again in Europe, you're likely to be living in a drafty building that's cold, but it may go back to the 15th century. We take buildings, I could name you some on South Neal Street that were only built in no more than 15 years ago, and they've been taken out for another use. Uh, Part of that has to be because uh, national groups get together and they have only one building of their own to be very efficient with, and so it's cheaper to take out the old building and put in a new. If you were in the eras of Sears Roebuck and other companies like that, you had at least 18 different types of houses you could put in. Uh, you had lots of items that you could buy out of catalogs. There was a multi-dimensional thing, and we need some of that again. We need uh, the people who do their own thing, just as small as going to the big dig and seeing uh, stones organized so that they make an image. Somebody had to do that, and uh, so yes, let's think about what we do every day with how we think and do, and then we need to read, and we need mentors. Many of the skills we eventually grow with are mentored to us by senior citizens that pass on. Uh, the young folk have the energy. The young folk can put in a faucet with the right amount of muscle and not break the uh, connection. But as you get older, you also accumulate a little bit of wisdom, and you get a chance to read and uh, go to movies and to pontificate. And so we have just across the road a smoke shop where people come and enjoy smoking. Smoking is something that is not been getting good reviews, but it is a place where people get together and enjoy. And it's a little bit like the English pub or the back block hotel in a very dry area in Australia. It's where you meet. It hasn't been a very friendly place for women. It was a bar mainly for men. So what did women do, and what are women doing now? It used to be that we had women at home and they stayed at home to develop large families. But when they got done with being large families, the women would be saving and preserving and standing on the mayor's doorstep to ask what they could do to help to preserve things that were significant. So we would have to be thankful for women in a different era. They didn't get to vote till the 1920s, and we have to think about that. We also have to think about the animals we use. Animals can be extremely friendly, and they have skills. They have fun. When you see a family of creatures running up the hill and then sliding down it, you know that they have emotions and they have an interest, and we can learn from animals. So dogs are especially friendly, and they have been man's friend. But we have a lot of to do with being able to keep dogs and feed dogs and know how they operate. Horses are the same. You can ride a horse and you can know that horse knows what is on his back, and he can stay just long enough for you to open the gate, and then he's off. And he almost has a sense of humor that you fell off because you didn't open the gate fast enough. Uh, and you have to get back on that horse. And just that interaction is tremendous. I think we're getting nearer to the end. I want to encourage you to think more about your recycling, and please think about little things, your shoelaces or your boots or whatever. And so leave a little time for Living Left do its announcements. And so this is Dave Monkey, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And listen to Left every once in a while. Their music is wonderful, and so are their announcements. And they've survived for 35 years, and they need your help and introduction. And thank you to Urbana Public Television for putting this up on Channel 6 for many, many years now. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk. Bye.